Sonoluminescence is when a bubble of air within water is excited by sound. The bubble begins to collapse under the intense pressure of the sound waves, forming partially ionized gas in the center. The temperature inside becomes as hot as the surface of the sun, creating a burst of bluish-white light.
Welcome back to Magic and the Noise. This week we're going to be talking about the target I tasked you with, which was sonoluminescence. Sonoluminescence is the emission of light from bubbles that implode in a liquid when they're excited by sound and they resonate at the right frequency.
And this was, for me, quite fascinating. So I was blind to this particular target, but also I had no clue this even existed up until Sasha had tasked me with this. And what blew my mind about this was how crazy it was. When I saw actual demonstrations of this, which they call star in a jar, I was shocked. And it's so bizarre that I'm like, this doesn't seem like this is actually real. Like, this is more fringe science, right? But when I went and did the research, which Sasha already understands, there's like a ton of research papers that are trying to understand how this works.
It's an interesting field of research for two reasons. One, because so many physicists are interested in it and start researching it and studying it. And there are a lot of papers that have been published on it. But then on the other hand, because it touches on energy, a lot of people are scared to push it too far. Some researchers who did push it into the realm of energy ended up getting canceled or disappeared or just stopped talking about it at some point in their career. So it's definitely an interesting field of study that's growing in relevance, I think, today. So I'm excited to go through the details of your session.
What we're going to do first is we're going to go through some of the symbolic components of that session work. One of the things that I thought was interesting with the session was that I had a couple of different concepts that were clustered together. And one of them was the concept of a stargate along with a winged skull. What was weird about it is I normally would see the wings behind the skull up, but in this case the wings were down, which I don't recall ever seeing before. But I just transcribed what I saw. The Greeks had the winged up skull as a transition from death from our realm to a higher realm. And then my thinking was with the wings down, perhaps it meant that Sono was basically coming down from a higher dimension into our dimension. And I think in your research, you found some additional information that was quite fascinating as well, right?
Yes, because I was looking for this references to the winged skull. And interestingly enough, I did see that Horus, because you mentioned Horus somewhere else in your session work, is also represented as the winged disc. And so I thought there was that connection there. And with Horus, his right eye represents the morning star. It represents power and quintessence. And this will come up later again. And his left eye represented the evening star. So again, it's that idea of you are referencing stars. And sonoluminescence is colloquially referred to as star in a jar.
Yes.
And so I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, that's interesting. We do see correlation with some of the other data later in the session that's more the science part. The other concept of a location that had a plaque with two keys with rays of light coming from behind them. And in that location, they had data that was both ancient and modern. There's a group that has access to the truth about Sono. And the other element of this that I thought was interesting was that they were spinning a tale in terms of communicating out to the scientific community a model that was false or not distorted, essentially. So that was a big cluster of information that I got through several pages. And there was also a connection to ISIS.
Yeah, so the cross keys are actually the emblem for the Vatican. And so when I saw that you had the plaque, the Vatican emblem on the wall by the Vatican Archive, where we often kind of think of the Vatican Archive as just storing all these old texts, but we don't realize that they're still adding to that archive. They're still adding new modern information because it's a storage of human knowledge.
Okay, that makes sense. That's interesting.
That kind of brought me to this biblical reference of the crossed keys. In the Bible, there are a lot of references to keys, and in particular, that's the interpretation that is usually tied when they are mentioned. In Matthew's Gospel, you have Jesus saying, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And I think that this is that paralleling of the Egyptian mantra of as above, so below, which has also been adopted by occultists. And so in the Vatican symbolism, the keys are turned up towards heaven to show that they were given into the hands of the Pope from heaven to earth. I think you're referencing the opposite. That's really interesting in terms of sonoluminescence. What do you think?
With the wings upright, the Greeks said that you were going and ascending to heaven across dimensions, essentially. And if the wings being down means Sonos coming from a higher dimension down to our dimension, then what you're referencing with the keys is saying the same thing. They're referencing two different dimensions, essentially.
I think as well, the skull is the skeleton, the idea of the skeleton key, which is the key that opens any lock. I think that's relevant, and I think it's a really beautiful metaphor for what's happening with sonoluminescence.
Yeah, I agree. That's fascinating. So as we move away from the symbolic components of the session work, I then picked up on more of what you would consider to be the contact with the physical components. So I got some electromechanical aspects, wires and circular discs, and there are transducers that are used to emit sound into the water volume in order to create the effect with sono. There's also air bubbles that are critical for this to work. I also picked up on a bubbling imagery. I saw it. It was quite clear to me. And I also got the concept that this might be a process on the same piece of information. And then finally, I saw a cold blue-white light that was a energetic type of explosion, which would be the sono itself. And at the time, I was trying to figure out like what this was. I was like, Big Bang, and it's like, that doesn't quite seem right. And then neutrino was another one that came up, or maybe new particle. So these were kind of ideas. Wasn't really sure what pieces were correct, but these elements of my session work were showing contact with the physicality aspect of the science of setting up the equipment.
Yes, it was amazing to see in your sketches the actual setup of the containers that they use to induce this effect. And like you said, the transducers that they push sound through water to make these bubbles implode and release the energy. And mainstream science, the reason that there is research still being done, so much curiosity about sonoluminescence, is because mainstream science can't explain where this energy is coming from properly. So they have found that depending on if they use a noble gas or air in the bubbles, depending on the temperature of the water, depending on the frequency that they use to implode the bubbles, they can get different temperatures and in the bubbles that they measure. And some of these temperatures are the surface of the sun levels of heat, and yet the water doesn't all evaporate in a flash. And so there's something really interesting going on that they don't understand. They don't know where the energy comes from. They don't know why it doesn't dissipate as heat and just evaporate the water and break the glass of the flask, right? And so that energy flashes out as this blue light. And you described it so perfectly. It was miraculous to see your session when you first submitted it to me. And I was still keeping the target secret so I could retask. And I was just so excited. It was just a perfect drawing of exactly what sonoluminescence is and what it's about and how it works and the mysteries around it. And I wanted to say one thing about neutrinos. Neutrinos don't participate with the electromagnetic interactions that go on in an atom. And so they just pass through matter unimpeded and undetectably. We still don't have a very good understanding of neutrinos. And I think that maybe what your session might be hinting at is this relationship between neutrinos and standing wave points in the ether. And that's the people who are looking into sonoluminescence are starting to move towards the theory of the ether because it does seem to be tied to that, the sonoluminiferous ether.
Interesting. And later in my session work, I got a chunk of data that was associated with neutrino came up again, and I had it as being the Rosetta Stone. What was interesting is that when I did this Google search for neutrino and Rosetta Stone, there's actual paper that was produced recently by some, I think, mathematicians where they felt they had the mathematical aspects that defined a neutrino that was a Rosetta Stone, so they actually titled it like that, which I found to be interesting. So although it wasn't specifically sono focused, there may be a correlation between that research information and sono itself.
Yes, and translation is actually another word for transformations in math. When you take a shape and then you transform it, you translate it across different axes in a different dimension. Essentially, you rotate it around an axis. So I thought that that was really relevant to what might be happening here.
Yeah, interesting. The next portion of the data that I wanted to cover, I had seen something that looked like a spiral graph visual. To me, I'd never seen anything like that before. I was trying to figure out like what that was. Something that's important, and it deals with the pathing, and it might have dealt with the pathing of neutrinos was another part of what I got as conceptually, but I wasn't really sure. Later, when I saw a video on the Hopf Fibration, which is a fourth dimensional concept, mathematical concept, they visually display that information. And when I looked at it, that was very much what I saw in that remote viewing session. So to me, I saw a linkage between that particular piece of information and starting to move into more of a mathematical explanation of what's happening and tying it with a fourth dimensional aspect, which I thought was interesting.
And the Hopf Fibration, that's when you're translating a three-dimensional shape into a four-dimensional shape and you're mapping it on, right? So you're creating, I guess, a fiber mapping. So this point on a sphere, let's say, marks out to this point on a four-dimensional representation of a sphere. And so every point maps one to one. To me, that ties into this idea again, right? Your session really seems to be pointing at the explanation for sonoluminescence being that this seems to be a phenomenon where we are having energy that is coming from, you can call it a higher dimension, another dimension, a shifted axis for electromagnetic energy propagation. These are all different terms, but they're all pointing to the same thing. There's energy that moves through our reality that we're not able to detect.
Yeah.
And every now and again, depending on certain conditions, especially tied to magnetic fields, this energy becomes detectable. It's surprising. And science has to grapple with it. They try to paper over it, and then eventually the data is overwhelming, and then it starts to force their hand to try to say, okay, we need to maybe change some of our theories to account for this.
The next portion of my session work, which for me was quite different, was that I actually saw a graph initially. It had three axes, so X, Y, Z, and there was a large circular form, and then more towards the middle there was a small circle. This would, of course, represent sono within the glass flask of water, essentially. At the time, I didn't know what I was looking at. I saw that there was a precise sort of vector. I think I had words like angular vector, rotating vector, but it was like you had to approach it from a very specific trajectory, essentially. And that's what the graph was trying to explain to me, was that that was critical in order to get the right effect. In this case, through my session work, I got some additional information about stabilization and slowing things down. And that came through this section of the data, which was going slower, supercooling would improve the stability of this particular thing, this physics. At this point, I was pretty clear that I was dealing with some kind of a physics thing. Still wasn't sure what it was, but that would help. We had seen some research after the fact that they have actually cooled down the liquid, that the water, and that the effect of sono goes up significantly. So my data actually recommended that was something that should be done. But in addition to that, I got formulas. I actually saw some of the formulas associated with this particular topic. And although I couldn't see every single aspect of them clear, I could see enough of the elements that I recorded, like there's some exponents here. And in one case, I got this weird line that I wasn't really sure. It's like, I think I've seen that before. I don't really know what it was. And you later identified it as an integral.
Integrals are used in calculus, and they're used to figure out the area under a curve. And this particular, when you have the elongated S, it's cumulative. So your curve might go up or down below the baseline, and you want to see what's the total area under the curve. I think this relates to sono because if you have a standing wave, which is what the sound is doing, it's resonating through the water, and you're wanting to calculate the energy in the water above and below the standing wave, it's just so relevant. Another thing that integrals are used for are to calculate the displacement of velocity. That's so relevant, again, because you were talking about vectors and rotation and these axes. It's that same idea that you have in standard reality. You have propagation of energy through the electrical and magnetic fields, and that's perpendicular. If you have a displacement of the velocity, so you have a vector, you're shifting away from one axis so that the energy can propagate through a different axis. And that just seems to tie everything together in your session. That's really what it's pointing to. I think that might be the key to the whole phenomenon of sonoluminescence. And when you were talking about slowing time down a little bit in order to have the effect endure or to sustain it for longer so that we can derive more energy from it, again, it's that idea of how do you maintain the coherence of that standing wave in the ether?
That's fascinating research and information that you've uncovered on this. I've looked at a bunch of research papers on this topic and seen correlations to different fragments of my session work. I'm wondering if they push the temperatures down even further, that they'll get even more improved results. Argon, if I understand correctly, is one of the key aspects within the air bubble that actually make this work. There are certain, I think, noble gases is what they're called, that can handle even lower temperatures than what they've used. And so there may be some interesting things that they could do by going even cooler with the experimentation. The last part that I kind of got, and I don't know if this is correct, but on this angular vector that was moving from the larger sphere towards the smaller sphere, which is Sono, I saw what looked like 3 strands. I saw it kind of like DNA, but I knew it wasn't DNA. And I was trying to understand what those strands were, but it was like these 3 rotating, kind of twisting strands. I get the idea of torsion fields, like Richard Hoagland's hyperdimensional physics concepts that he's talked about. That kind of came in as a concept like it's kind of in that category in a way, in terms of what I was seeing. The other thing I got was the potential for these strands to be different magnetics with different polarization, essentially, which didn't really make sense to me, like how that would work. I also saw like a complex computer system that would be required to translate all this information. I think right now they're just using simple frequencies so you can see exactly what's going on. It seems pretty simple. But this, like, to solve the problem, it looked like you might need a much more complex model, which probably would make sense if it's 4th dimensional. And you would need, like, you would not be able to just like, oh, I'm just going to plug in like the simple frequency. It's like, it's way more complex than that. At least that's what I was seeing through the remote viewing session.
When I was looking at your data, I had a flash visualization of polarized magnetic fields. And this is something that I've never heard of before. We know that light actually travels in a helix pattern. At one part of your session, you had from the side and then from the front, and it looked like a cymatic pattern. When I saw that, I realized no one in the popular culture ever really talks about polarizing magnetic fields. Because I had such a strong flash of it when I was looking at your data, I looked it up, and it is a thing. There is research being done on how do you polarize magnetic fields.
Wow.
And so what you're describing, it's already something that science has started to acknowledge, that you can polarize magnetic fields, that they also can be made to push energy through in a helix motion pattern.
Wow.
I just think it's really fascinating, and I think that you might have come through with a key to solving sonoluminescence so that it can be used to produce more energy more easily. It's already reliable, but just so that we can use it as a power source. The idea of the magnetic fields, the 3 maybe different polarizations of the magnetic fields. I would like to talk to some physicists who are researching this.
Yeah, I would love that too, to see what their thoughts are on the information. The problem with this session is it's so complex, and you can see so many tie-ins to different research papers on this particular topic. It's difficult to sort of collate it all together and kind of communicate it out.
And a lot of it is cutting-edge science, and it's complex science. If there is anyone in our audience right now who does research on sonoluminescence, we would love to talk to you. We would love to have a conversation with you about the data that came through in David's work, about any insights that might have for you, and we could retask David to get more information. Would you be open to that, David?
Gonna work me a little harder? Yeah, I guess that's fine.
There's always this idea of, how do we treat remote viewers? Do we push them and push them and push them? Or are they too delicate and fragile? And so for this one, I really pushed you. And I'm glad I did, because the results are great.
So we hope that you've enjoyed this video and the topic and the discussion. We are going to cover some more information, kind of an after hours, because this topic is so complex. We're going to dig in a little deeper, but we're going to do that over on Patreon. So if you want to join us there, you can. But if not, we hope that you enjoyed this free video.
Let us know in the comments down below what you thought of this, what you thought of the data, what you think of sonoluminescence. And like we said earlier, reach out to us if this is your area of research and you have anything helpful to add. If you see something in David's session that resonates with you, if you recognize it as, oh, I'm doing research in physics and this ties in, we would love to hear from you.
Yes. Until next time.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.